Okay, I'm starting with an epigraph that came from my Facebook page yesterday, which I discovered as I was moving through it, and given the theme of the conference, you'll see why I found it kind of interesting. As I flipped down, I suddenly was confronted with a text that said, "Telling where you've been is one thing, showing it is a whole new story." It was a sponsored advertisement for Land Rovers. And that leads me into what I want to talk about here, which is the presentational, the way that life is either presented or presented as almost an invitation to us online, and some of the implications for that. But more than anything else, what I want to do is, well, I'll explain. In December of 2014, a new feature called Year in Review appeared on many Facebook pages. Generated by an algorithm that extracted photos from user archives based on the number of likes, ordered them by months, then displayed them, accompanied by a cheesy music soundtrack, this slideshow enticed clicks with the tagline, "It's been a great year, thanks for being part of it," and suggested customizing the slideshow, then sharing the result with your friends. Unfortunately, for some of those being hailed, it had actually not been a great year. And when they viewed the slideshow, some were confronted with images framed by holiday clip art of their children who had suffered and died of horrible diseases earlier in the year. A visual parade of divorced spouses, dead pets, false friends, estranged relatives, times of sickness. Well, you get the picture. To be fair, Facebook responded quickly. First, Zuckerberg and company created an empathy team. Although it actually proved to be more concerned with pairing team members and small businesses to create advertising campaigns. And perhaps more significantly for my purposes, the company no longer refers internally to the 1.25 billion signed up on Facebook as users. The accepted term now is people. Other participants in the symposium have thought about and published much important work on how lives are represented online. Smith and Watson and Gilmore come immediately to mind, and Julie Rack, Gillian Whitlock, and Paul Arthur are featured in Lives Online 2.0, the spring 2015 special issue of Biography, an interdisciplinary quarterly edited by Laurie McNeil and John Zern that appeared last week. And over the last 2 days, we have raised a whole range of topics related to our theme. What I would like to do is cite a couple of examples that distill in some ways the concerns that should vex us, and then end to make way for questions, some of them my own, and discussion. The three things I'm going to talk about are people, banality, and simulation and representation. We've already talked in some ways about people. You can see that the algorithm has had a kind of affect. This is an affect algorithm to try and set up the photos, going for a conventional mode of recognition, nostalgia, and sentimentality. The main point I want to make here is this notion that whether online or offline, people are living their lives. And that the consequences are sort of not only sort of interpenetrated, but they're also highly politicized and also have profound ethical implications. I'll use an example here, a couple of them. One has to do with a problem that they've been facing in Japan, where rather elderly couples are having to confront the fact that their children, sometimes now in their mid-40s, have in fact been doing nothing but be in their room playing video games or being online. And you've got concerns where parents are getting to the stage of wanting to retire or being concerned they're going to die, and have children who have been in that environment, and that they have essentially been providing the support for that. That's one mode, where you've got a situation where a life has been in some ways lived online, but look at the support that needs to be there, whether technological or even food, and also clearly some kind of expressed, although it may perhaps pathological, preference for being in that environment than the alternative. It doesn't quite work as a binary because both are going on simultaneously, even though it seems to be such an extreme case. I'm now going to juxtapose that with another extreme case, which is the use of drones. This is work indebted to Michael Shapiro, who is publishing on this fairly soon. What we're looking at here is a situation where what he's referring to is necrobiography. In his forthcoming book, Politics and Time, documenting the event, he responds to Gregor Chamayou, who has written on drones, and asks what authorizes somebody to engage in manhunting. Shapiro is talking about this in relation to Robert Greenwald's documentary film Unmanned: America's Drone Wars. The point here is this, that within the drone environment, there is a notion that in fact previous research is being done to construct a documentary life, a biography that ultimately justifies its termination. And that in fact, the one thing we know for certain, and we are continually assured about drone technology, is that it has a higher standard of verification than any other. That in fact, we are told that that is the highest possible investment in certainty that the targets, the people who are killed, are being killed for a justifiable reason. All right? What he points out there is that this notion that somehow or other that kind of surveillance is giving us a kind of privileged and even perfect access to the way that the world operates, that basically by being online and put in proximity to these situations, you can therefore understand and make those kinds of decisions. It goes all the way back to that valorization of technology. If you think in 1991, when you had the first Gulf War, one of the experiences that was offered the international community was riding in on the missiles as they hit the targets. We've seen this endlessly reduplicated as we've been put on top of bullets in various kinds of films. American Sniper did this just recently. And there's this notion that the technology is so good that as outside witnesses online, vicariously, we can actually watch the results and that they're carried out exactly in the way that they're supposed to. Now, what we've switched over to in the ensuing 20 years is the notion that that technology, which was initially presented to us as virtually infallible, even though subsequently we found out a lot of those missiles did not hit where they were going and so on and so forth, is now the technology that is allowing a kind of distance, that is allowing a kind of certainty that does not require boots on the ground, does not require actually that basically people online can affect material change in the world, and actually with a greater degree of certainty of doing what is right in doing that. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that the way that they do this is by using drones then to mark the behavior of the people that have often been identified by informers or whatever as targets. Then what they do is use surveillance to watch them to see that they in fact are conforming to the pattern of somebody who is going to the places where somebody who would be an enemy would be going. Once this has been done sufficiently, they not only have confirmed that this is the life they are living as a potential terrorist, but in fact then know where they can in fact attack them. Okay? Now, a couple of things happen as a consequence of that. One thing, which is moving to the third thing I'm talking about, the way that the training takes place for dealing with these considerations is in fact through a series of simulations. All right, and this distinction between simulation and representation, I'm drawing in some ways from what Julie Rack was talking about. It seems to me is one of the places that you can make a kind of useful distinction between online and offline lives, if you're going to do that. Because the simulation, all right, is actually a kind of training and even a deadening for carrying out. The way that you train somebody to do this kind of killing is by putting them in endless simulations of doing that. Then, when it actually comes up that they are given the name of the target, they then proceed through, all right, sitting hundreds, thousands of miles away, carrying out the act, and then, as they've been finding subsequently, then often entering into further simulations, which are ways of either debriefing or dealing with the problem that you're starting to get people who are developing post-traumatic stress for actions that they are actually carrying out thousands of miles away from where they happen. All right. So this issue of simulation and representation, one of the things that, quote, online lives points us to is the fact that we are increasingly moving away from being able to distinguish between those things. That simulation, to go back to the Japanese son, simulation is in fact how that life is being lived. That is the primary activity, that it is being carried out for most of waking hours and so on and so forth. The same thing is going on with the trained military and the people involved in surveillance who are spending a substantial part of their lives in an environment where only if somebody tells them will they actually know that this is not a test, that there's no meaningful distinction or even a necessity to tell the person whether they're engaged in a simulation or in actually carrying out the act. Okay? Now, one final thing in relation to this, I think this environment is not just being created by the technology, but it's also being created by the events of the last 16 years. Because the obsession with security, surveillance, protection of data, that whole engagement with how we exist online, has basically developed and exfoliated during the same period of time of an increased obsession with security, surveillance, integrity, and safety, and the continual assurance that in fact your data, the way that you are interpolated into that environment, is being done in a way that is keeping you safe. Now, what has happened in relation to the drone material, the documentary that Shapiro points to, is that in the face of that particular statement, what they did was the documentary filmmaker interviewed one of the people who in fact was operating the drones and left because of post-traumatic stress, and him talking about operating that and the environment and how that was happening, then juxtaposed with the family and friends of a 16-year-old soccer-playing teenager who ended up being the target of one of these. And apparently the detail that ultimately led to his execution was the fact that one of the really suspicious things that they monitored him going to was a meeting about how the community was going to deal with the threat of drones. So when we're looking at these environments, this is where Edward Snowden comes in, because what Edward Snowden did more than anything else was point out that the illusion of perfect security and safety for the data is in fact one of the things that allows it to be used in these variety of ways and continually recuperated as something that is not only necessary, but somehow rather technologically sublime. It reminds me of the Arnold Schwarzenegger film in which Jamie Lee Curtis is playing his wife. It's called True Lies, and at a certain point she discovers that the man she thought was a rather boring husband is actually a professional hitman. She said, "You kill people?" And his response is, "They were all bad." Now, I don't really in some ways have a conclusion to draw on this. I wanted to just raise some of these notions, but what I did want to present was this notion of simulation versus representation. This notion of simulation as not in some ways being something different from life, but in fact being a process of life that we all engage in the simulated world of online. The other thing I wanted to do was actually push this toward being able to engage all of you in a further discussion of some of the ideas that have come up along the way. And I have one particular thing that I would like to ask for. After I've thanked Max and Claire and everybody for creating the virtual environment we've been living in, or it feels like for the last 2 days. The other thing I would like to ask, though, is, and I'm deliberately putting you on the spot, the graduate students, the post-graduates involved in the program who have been participating in various ways, and we also have Serafina here. One of the things that we've seen in terms of engaging with what our field of life writing really needs to deal with as telling concerns has been the presentation by younger scholars of what is materially of concern to them. In this particular case, the graduate students and the postdocs we're talking about, in fact, were picked because of their investment in issues of online lives or whatever. So the question I'm asking very simply is, what did we not talk about enough, or what are we clearly oblivious to in terms of what's really important in the way that you're engaging with your work? And I'll stop.